Tied to a tree, she was freed by a feared gunslinger at sunset. Chapter 1. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, a weathered frontier town that had seen better days. Saloon doors creaked in the hot wind as tumbleweeds rolled past the general store where Martha Henderson worked 6 days a week, saving every penny she could scrape together. Martha wiped the sweat from her brow as she stacked canned goods on the wooden shelves. At 23, she carried herself with quiet determination, her calloused hands telling the story of a woman who had worked hard her entire life. The faded blue dress she wore had been mended countless times, but she kept it clean and pressed, maintaining her dignity despite her circumstances. "Martha, you finish up that inventory and head on home," called out Mr. Jameson, the store owner, a kind man in his 60s who had given her work when no one else would. "Storm's coming in from the east, and you don't want to be caught walking home in that." She nodded gratefully, knowing the 3-mile walk to her small cabin would be treacherous if the rains came. As she secured the last of the supplies, the bell above the door chimed, and 3 rough-looking men entered. Their spurs jangled against the wooden floor, and the smell of whiskey and tobacco followed them like a shadow. "Well, well," sneered Jake Morrison, the leader of the group, his weathered face split by a cruel grin. "If it ain't the pretty little store clerk. You know, Martha, my offer still stands. Come work for me at the saloon, and you'll make more money in one night than you do here in a month." Martha's jaw tightened. She had heard this proposition before, and her answer never changed. "I'm not interested, Mr. Morrison. I have respectable work here." The other 2 men chuckled darkly as Morrison stepped closer, his boots clicking against the floor. "Respectable work that keeps you poor as a church mouse. You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" Mr. Jameson stepped forward, his voice firm despite his age. "That's enough, Morrison. The lady has made her feelings clear. I suggest you and your boys find what you need and move along." Morrison's hand moved instinctively to the gun at his hip, but he caught himself. Even he wouldn't dare shoot down an unarmed storekeeper in broad daylight. Instead, he leaned in close to Martha, his breath hot against her ear. "This ain't over, sweetheart. One way or another, you'll come around to my way of thinking." As the 3 men left, Martha felt a chill run down her spine, despite the oppressive heat. She had heard whispers around town about Morrison's methods of persuasion, and none of them ended well for the women involved. That evening, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, Martha locked up the store and began her walk home. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of a violent storm. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and quickened her pace. The first drops of rain began to fall just as she reached the halfway point of her journey. Within minutes, the gentle sprinkle had turned into a torrential downpour. Martha sought shelter under a large oak tree, hoping the storm would pass quickly. It was then that she heard the sound of horses approaching through the rain. Her heart sank as she recognized the voices of Morrison and his men. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. As the 3 riders emerged from the storm, their faces illuminated by flashes of lightning, Martha knew her worst fears were about to become reality. Chapter 2. The rain hammered down like bullets from heaven as Morrison and his men dismounted, their boots squelching in the mud. Martha pressed herself against the rough bark of the oak tree, her heart pounding so hard she feared they might hear it over the storm. "Well, look what we have here," Morrison called out, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "Lost little lamb, all alone in the storm." Martha's voice was steady despite her fear. "Leave me alone, Jake. I haven't done anything to you." "Oh, but you have," he replied, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "You've been disrespecting me in front of the whole town, making me look like a fool every time I tried to be nice to you." The other 2 men, brothers named Cole and Danny Reeves, flanked Martha as Morrison approached. They were known throughout the territory for their cruelty, men who had drifted into Copper Ridge 6 months ago and had been causing trouble ever since. "Boss," Cole said, his voice a low growl, "maybe we should just take her back to town. Folks might come looking." Morrison shook his head, rain streaming down his face. "No, boy. This here's a lesson that needs teaching. Sometimes a woman needs to learn her place the hard way." Before Martha could react, Danny grabbed her arms and began tying her to the tree with the length of rope he had brought. She struggled against him, but he was too strong, his hands rough and calloused from years of violence. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I never meant any harm." "Should have thought of that before you started acting all high and mighty," Morrison spat. "Now you're going to stay here and think about what you've done. Maybe by morning you'll be ready to listen to reason." As they secured the ropes, Martha's mind raced. The storm was getting worse, and being tied to a tree in the middle of it could mean death. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the cruel faces of her captors. "We'll be back come sunrise," Morrison said, mounting his horse, "assuming you survive the night. If you do, maybe you'll be more agreeable to my proposition." The three men rode off into the storm, leaving Martha alone with the wind and rain. She pulled against the ropes, but they held fast. The bark of the tree scraped against her back as she tried to free herself, and she could feel blood beginning to seep through her dress. Hours passed. The storm raged on, and Martha's strength began to fail. Her dress was soaked through, and the cold was setting into her bones. She had nearly given up hope when she heard something that made her heart skip, the sound of a single horse approaching through the rain. At first, she thought Morrison had returned, but as the rider drew closer, she could see it was someone else entirely. A lone figure on a black horse, moving with the confidence of someone who knew these lands well. The rider stopped a few feet away, and Martha could make out the silhouette of a tall man in a long coat. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment she could see his face clearly. It was weathered and hard, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much violence and death. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and his hair was long and unkempt beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Please!" Martha called out, her voice hoarse from hours of calling into the storm. "Help me!" The man dismounted slowly, his hand never leaving the grip of the gun at his hip. He approached cautiously, like a wolf studying its prey. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Jake Morrison and his men," Martha replied, shivering uncontrollably. "They left me here to die." The stranger's eyes narrowed at the mention of Morrison's name. Without saying another word, he drew a knife from his belt and began cutting the ropes. His movements were precise and efficient, and within moments, Martha was free. She collapsed to her knees, her legs unable to support her after hours of being bound. The stranger caught her before she could fall completely, his strong arms steady despite the storm raging around them. "Can you ride?" he asked. Martha nodded weakly, though she wasn't sure if it was true. The stranger helped her to her feet and led her to his horse. As he lifted her onto the saddle, she noticed the way he moved, like a man accustomed to violence, always ready for trouble. "What's your name?" she asked as he mounted behind her. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, as they rode through the storm toward the lights of Copper Ridge, he spoke. "Name's Colt Walker. And lady, you just made yourself some very dangerous enemies." Chapter 3. The storm had passed by the time they reached the outskirts of Copper Ridge, leaving the streets muddy and gleaming under the pale light of dawn. Colt Walker guided his horse through the empty streets, Martha clinging to the saddle horn as exhaustion threatened to overtake her. "Where do you live?" he asked, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Just outside town," Martha replied, pointing toward a small cabin visible on a hill beyond the last row of buildings. "But I can walk from here." "You've done enough." Walker shook his head. "Morrison and his boys will be looking for you. You need to get inside and stay there." As they rode toward her cabin, Martha found herself studying the man who had saved her. Everything about him spoke of danger. The way he sat in the saddle, the careful way his eyes scanned the horizon, the worn grip of his gun. She had heard whispers about men like him, gunfighters who drifted from town to town, leaving death in their wake. "Are you a gunslinger?" she asked quietly. Walker was silent for a long moment. "I'm a man who's good with a gun. Whether that makes me a gunslinger depends on who's asking and why." They reached her cabin as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Walker helped her down from the horse, his hands steady and sure. Martha's legs nearly gave out again, but she managed to stay upright. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than she had ever meant anything. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't owe me anything," Walker replied. Just stay inside and keep your door locked. Morrison won't let this go." As he turned to leave, Martha called out to him, "Wait, where will you go?" Walker paused, his back still turned. "I'll be around. Got some business to settle in town." Martha watched him ride away, disappearing into the morning mist like a ghost. She went inside her cabin and barred the door, then collapsed into a chair by the window. Her whole body ached, and her dress was torn and blood-stained, but she was alive. Hours later, the sound of horses approaching made her heart race. She peered through the window and saw Morrison and his men riding up to her cabin. They looked angry and dangerous, their faces twisted with rage. "Martha!" Morrison shouted, pounding on her door. "Open up! We need to talk!" "Go away!" she called back, her voice shaking. "I have nothing to say to you." "The hell you don't!" Morrison kicked at the door, making the whole cabin shake. "You made a fool of me last night, running off like that, and now you've got that stranger involved." "Who is he?" Martha didn't answer. She had no idea who Colt Walker really was, but she wasn't about to give Morrison any information that might help him track the man down. "Fine!" Morrison snarled. "Have it your way, but this ain't over. You hear me? This ain't over." The men rode away, but Martha knew they would be back. She spent the rest of the day in her cabin, jumping at every sound, every creak of the wooden walls. As evening approached, she began to wonder if she would ever feel safe again. Just as the sun was setting, she heard a single horse approaching. Her heart pounded as she looked out the window, expecting to see Morrison. Instead, she saw Colt Walker riding slowly toward her cabin. She opened the door before he could knock, relief flooding through her. "I thought you had left town." Walker dismounted, his expression serious. "I've been asking around about Morrison. He's got friends in high places, including the sheriff. You're not safe here." "Then what do I do?" Martha asked, the desperation clear in her voice. "I can't just run away. This is my home, my life." Walker studied her for a long moment, and Martha could see something changing in his eyes. "There might be another way, but it's dangerous, and it means trusting me completely." "I already trust you," Martha said without hesitation. "You saved my life." Walker nodded slowly. "Then listen carefully. Tomorrow Morrison's going to make his move. He's planning to take you whether you want to go or not. But I'm going to be waiting for him." "You're going to face all three of them?" Martha asked, her eyes wide with fear. "That's suicide." "Maybe," Walker replied, "but I've been in worse situations. The question is, are you willing to let me try?" Martha looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected. Not just the hardness of a gunfighter, but something deeper. A man who had been running from his past, looking for something worth fighting for. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'm willing." As Walker prepared to leave, Martha caught his arm. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Walker paused, his expression softening slightly. "Maybe that's exactly why I'm doing it. In my line of work, you don't get many chances to do the right thing. This might be mine." Sata Chapter 4. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with no trace of the storm that had changed everything just 2 days before. Martha sat by her window, watching the road that led to town, knowing that whatever happened today would determine the rest of her life. She had spent the night thinking about Colt Walker, trying to understand the man who had risked everything to save her. There was something in his eyes, a pain that spoke of loss and regret, that made her believe he was more than just another gunfighter. At precisely noon, she saw the dust cloud on the horizon that meant riders were approaching. Her heart began to race as she counted the horses, 3 of them, just as Walker had predicted. Morrison and his men were coming to make good on their threat. But as they drew closer, Martha saw something that made her breath catch. There was a 4th horse, a black stallion standing in the shade of a large boulder beside the road. Colt Walker was already in position, waiting for them. Morrison and his men rode past the boulder without seeing Walker, their attention focused on the cabin ahead. They dismounted about 50 yards from Martha's door, their hands resting on their guns. "Martha!" Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "Time to stop playing games. You're coming with us one way or another." Martha opened her door and stepped outside, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Jake Morrison." "The hell you're not!" Morrison snarled, starting toward her. "I've had enough of your high and mighty attitude." That's when Colt Walker stepped out from behind the boulder, his long coat flowing in the breeze. The three men stopped dead in their tracks, their hands moving instinctively to their guns. "That's far enough," Walker said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced death many times and lived to tell about it. Morrison turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "Well, well, if it isn't the mysterious stranger, you picked the wrong fight, mister." "Did I?" Walker asked, taking a step forward. "Seems to me you're the ones who picked a fight with an innocent woman." Cole Reeves, the larger of the two brothers, spat in the dirt. "Ain't none of your business, gunslinger. Ride on out of here while you still can." Walker's hand moved to hover over his gun. "I'm making it my business. The lady doesn't want to go with you, and that's the end of it." 3 against 1, Morrison said with a cruel smile. "I like those odds." "Then make your play," Walker replied, his voice deadly calm. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind rustling through the grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Martha held her breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine who lived and who died. Morrison was the first to draw, his hand flashing toward his gun with the speed of a man who had killed before. But Walker was faster, so fast that his gun seemed to appear in his hand like magic. The report of his pistol echoed across the landscape, and Morrison staggered backward, clutching his shoulder. The Reeves brothers drew their guns a split second later, but Walker was already moving. He dove to the side, rolled behind a wooden water trough, and came up firing. Danny Reeves cried out and fell, his gun spinning away across the dirt. Cole Reeves got off one shot that splintered the wood near Walker's head before the gunfighter's return shot found its mark. The big man dropped to his knees, then fell forward onto his face. Morrison, wounded but still alive, tried to raise his gun with his good hand. Walker was on him in an instant, kicking the weapon away and standing over him with his pistol pointed at the man's head. "It's over, Morrison," Walker said quietly. "You and your boys are finished in this town." Morrison looked up at him with hatred burning in his eyes. "You think you've won something? There'll be others. Men like you always make enemies." "Maybe," Walker replied, "but that's a problem for another day." He looked up at Martha, who was standing in her doorway with tears streaming down her face. "It's safe now. They won't bother you again." As Walker helped Morrison to his feet and began tying him up, Martha walked toward them. She had expected to feel relief, but instead she felt something else, a profound sadness that this man who had saved her would now disappear from her life forever. "What happens now?" she asked. Walker finished securing Morrison's bonds and turned to face her. "Now I take these 3 to the sheriff. If he won't hold them, I'll make sure they understand what happens if they come back." "And then?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. Walker was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the horizon. "Then I move on. It's what I do." Martha stepped closer to him, her heart pounding. "What if you didn't have to? What if you stayed?" Walker met her eyes, and she saw the longing there, the part of him that wanted to believe in a different kind of life. "I'm not the staying kind, Martha. Men like me, we bring trouble wherever we go." "You brought me safety," she said softly. "You brought me hope." For a moment, Walker seemed to waver. Then he shook his head and turned away. "Hope is for people who haven't seen what I've seen, done what I've done." As he loaded the wounded men onto their horses, Martha made a decision that surprised even her. "Then stay long enough to show me what you've seen. Let me decide if it changes anything." Walker paused, his hands stilling on the rope. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know I'm asking you to trust me the way I trusted you," Martha replied. "When I was tied to that tree, I thought I was going to die, but you saved me. Maybe I can save you too." Walker looked at her for a long time, and Martha could see the battle raging inside him. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll stay through the week, but when I go alone. That's the deal." Martha smiled, knowing that a week was more than she had hoped for. "That's the deal." As the sun set over Copper Ridge, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, Martha Henderson and Colt Walker stood together outside her cabin. Neither of them spoke about the future, about what would happen when the week was over, But for the first time in longer than either could remember, they both felt something they had thought was lost forever: hope. The gunfighter had saved the woman tied to the tree at sunset. But as the days passed, Martha began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she might be able to save him too. In a land where violence was the only law and trust was a luxury few could afford, two wounded souls had found each other in the storm. Whether they could build something lasting from the ashes of their past remained to be seen. But for now, in the fading light of an Arizona evening, it was enough to know that they would face whatever came next together.